you turn in your Bibles to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. I need to set up the context of this verse. Solomon has been part of what he hopes will be a revival in the kingdom. There has been a time of great unrest. David, his father, has gone to be with the Lord, and it's left the kingdom pretty much in a shambles. The crown prince was murdered by the second heir. The second heir was then killed by Joab. There is a question of the line of succession that had, in the midst of all that killing, led to a rebellion where David had to flee from the throne. And now Solomon, who's a much younger son, is picked as the sort of what we would call today the dark horse candidate and is made king. And he now is ready to dedicate the temple that God did not allow David to make, because God said, David, you're a man of blood, you can't make the temple. So David gathered all the materials he could and prepared for the day, but wasn't allowed to begin. Solomon has been building on the temple for 7 years. And it's now time to do the dedication. And they come together for the Feast of Tabernacles, and they stay in their tents on the roof for 7 days. And on the 8th day, they call a solemn assembly. And at that solemn assembly, they decide, no, we haven't really done this enough. 7 days isn't enough. So they go back and they start all over again, and they have another 7 days of purification as they are in their tabernacles. And on the second 8th day, they come together to dedicate the temple. And if you read the beginning of chapter 14, it talks about the dedication service and what is said there. And we pick up the story in verse 11, 2 Chronicles 7:11. When Solomon had finished the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and had succeeded in carrying out all he had in mind to do in the temple of the Lord and in his own palace, the Lord appeared to him at night and said, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open, and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. We've been talking about returning to the ancient paths. And if this is not a day when you are at the height of your spiritual walk, if you cannot with honesty say, there has never been a time that I have been more fully surrendered to the Spirit and walking in the power of the presence of God, then what is true of every person who admits that honestly is we need a fresh awakening. And the way to that fresh awakening is to return to the ancient paths. Now, that's the opposite of what most of the major people... I just do want to make a statement. Somebody was talking to me, several people were talking to me this week about a national pastor, Alan Jackson. I don't know him. I know a number of you listen to him. Maybe some of you do not. And I just have to say that it is good to finally hear some men standing up and preaching the truth rather than the pap that has passed for the supposed gospel for so long. We need to return to the ancient paths, not some new or novel idea about what will bring about a fresh awakening, either personally, in a church, in a community, or in the nation, or even around the world. The Bible is absolutely clear. We need to go back to the ancient paths. We began getting specific about that last week with talking about worship and about the priority of worship and how worship is so essential to a fresh experience of God's presence. But it has to be the right kind of worship because the Bible says many negative things about worship that is not done in the right way. Today we come to the topic of prayer. And if there is any of the spiritual disciplines that is highly related to revival, whether personal, whether group, or even national, it is the discipline of prayer. And I want us to go through because there's a lot of people who can quote 2 Chronicles 7:14, but I wonder how much time we have really spent looking at exactly what it says. There's a lot packed in to these couple of verses. And so I want us to go through 2 Chronicles 7. We're actually going to do verses 13 and 14 and unpack what is the relationship between prayer and God coming back among His people. He begins in verse 13, God does, with the timing of the prayer He's talking about. And notice what He says. He says, when. This prayer is vital in certain times. It's not a prayer that is always vital. It is a prayer that is vital when. And so He lists some things. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain. When I command the locust to devour the land. Or when I send a plague among my people. Now let's stop right there because He does. I don't believe this list is exhaustive. I believe it is illustrative. It gives illustrations of things. And of the three things that He lists, what is the commonality between them? They are all dire circumstances. They are all dire circumstances. Now, we live in a world in which food is shipped around the globe. You can have oranges in the middle of January, fresh squeezed into your glass. They came from somewhere in South America, maybe in very southern Florida. They arrived here within days of being picked. and you can have them on your table. But that was not the case when these verses were written the better part of 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, if the local crop failed, you had every chance of starving to death. Do you know why so many of us today have a weight problem? Have you ever wondered about that? It's because our ancestors were the ones that survived the famines. People whose metabolism easily slows down so that when there's not enough food to eat, the weight that they've packed on provides for them to last through that famine are the ones that survive. The ones with that metabolism that we all like today, that just burns through food, and man, they can eat as much as they want and stay skinny as a rail. When a real famine comes and they go a year or two with not enough to eat, they're the ones that you bury. With us, that's a big problem because we have enough to eat today, and we probably will tomorrow and the next day, and we certainly have for the last 50 years, right? The only problem we have with food is we've got too much of it. But when it didn't rain for them, they didn't have food. They didn't have deep wells drilled down hundreds of feet that could draw up water. The only wells they had, they dug by hand. You know how far you can go down with a hand-dug well? When the locusts came, that crop, ready for harvest, everything's good. Tomorrow you're going out, and you go out tomorrow morning, and it's a stripped field because the locusts have swept through. Or when plague. Hey, anybody here remember a couple years ago? People were screaming, stay in your house, don't come out. Wear masks and hazmat suits. And we've never faced a real plague. As troublesome as COVID has been, and in some ways continues to be, it was nothing like plagues of the past. It was nothing like the bubonic plague or smallpox, where literally entire towns were emptied of people. And so he says, when there are troublesome, alarming situations. Now let me ask you, are there alarming situations in the world today? Or how about right here in our nation? When you can't trust that elections are fair, how do you keep a democracy? When you can't trust the media to tell the truth, how can you know what's honestly happening? Now you say those aren't big things, but for people who have the sovereign power to choose the course of their future, those things are devastating. And the results are what? Cities literally being burned down? Can anybody, do you remember what they used to call California? The Golden Coast. Do you remember when they called it that? The Golden State, but that was the Golden Coast. Because the streets were paved with gold. Now they're paved with human feces. And that is not an exaggeration. When things that are dramatically wrong occur. Verse 14. If, and I want to focus on that word because there is a question. Just because the situation gets bleak doesn't mean God's people will respond. There are many times that we react in different ways. Do you remember, those of you who are alive, isn't it amazing? I'm teaching now in a high school, but even then, they weren't even alive when 9/11 happened. College students weren't alive when 9/11 happened. Do you remember the weeks after 9/11? A week, maybe two, and then people said, no, we don't need to call on God. We can take care of it. We'll rebuild better than ever. We've got this. We'll put planes in the air and shoot down anybody that threatens us. We'll send in the Army, the Navy, the Marines. There's an if there. If my people. It's not a foregone conclusion. No matter how much God turns up the thermostat of trouble, there are people who refuse to acknowledge that they need to turn to Him. The song that we sing, we're going to have to sing that again one of these days. And there's the line in it says, and they're searching for an answer from anyone but Him. Let's look to the Supreme Court. Let's look to the politicians. Let's look to the next election. Let's look to that candidate or this candidate. If my people. The fate of the United States of America does not rest in the hands of the politicians. It does not rest in the hands of the populace or the popular vote. It does not rest in the hands of the corrupt media or in the fallen educational system that is turning out people who simply do not know up from down. God doesn't say if the politicians, if the nobility, if the media, if the people themselves. He says, if my people. The future of any nation rests with God's people. We have an outsized responsibility. You say, well, we're just a little church. I'm just a little individual. There's 340 or 350 million Americans. What do I count? I'm one out of 350 million. We have an outsized responsibility because God says, I am only looking at one group when I shut up the heavens, when I cause disasters to come, when the cities burn down, when the violence grows, when the political system becomes corrupted. In that day, I look to one group of people, my people, who are called by my name. Look with me over at Daniel. Please put a marker in 2 Chronicles because we will be back. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. Verse 17, Daniel chapter 9. Verse 17. This is Daniel's prayer that he's praying in a time, and we're going to talk about that prayer at greater length later, but I want just to see how he ends it. He says, Daniel 9:17. Daniel 9:17, now, our God, hear the prayers and petitions of your servant for your sake, O Lord. Look with favor on your sanctuary. Give ear, O God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the devastation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy, O Lord. Listen, O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hear and act for your sake. O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. Notice where the focus of his prayer was? It was all about him. It was all about him. So often, the prayers that we are taught to pray in America today are prayers about us. Do you remember a book that was a massive bestseller 30 years or so ago? Maybe it's been longer, time rushes on. The Prayer of Jabez. Lord, enlarge my territory and make me great and give me a name. And boy, people bought that by the millions. They made the author of that book a multimillionaire. But that isn't what prayer is about. Prayer is about your name, your city, your people, your kingdom, your honor, your glory. What did Jesus say? When you pray, pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, not my name. And all the false teachers on TV and all the false teachers and all the pulpits in America that extol this selfish praying. Prayer is, it's about your name, oh God. We might be upset about what's happening in the culture, but whose name is being vilified? Whose name is being degraded? Whose kingdom is being despised? Whose law is being spurned? Not me. It's kind of interesting being a pastor, especially working in the secular world. I don't announce that I'm a pastor unless it becomes some way where if I don't do it, I'm not being honest. But people treat you a little differently. And there's a fella that I'm working with at my new job, and he didn't know I was a pastor. And he's a rough welder, and he has a mouth on him. And he found out I was a pastor, and he started to talk the way he normally does. And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I'm like, "It's not my name you're taking in vain. You didn't curse me. You didn't stand there going, 'Oh, Jenkins!'" I'm not the one you need to apologize to. It's His name. It's His honor. It's His glory. Let's go back to 2 Chronicles. God then gives three specific responsibilities of His people during that time. Let's go down through them. If my people who are called by my name, that's who it is, will. Here's the three things we have to do. First of all, will humble themselves. We live in a day in which the church idolizes the antithesis of humility. I don't even know that it's pride. It's something just gross and unseemly. You have people strutting around on stage, showing off their rings and talking about their jets and their mansions and their... in the name of Jesus. Remember, Jesus was the first billionaire, right? He cornered the market on sand or something, I don't know. He owned a chain of hotels all across the Roman world and traveled in a luxury jet, right? And so therefore his followers certainly can't get by with just one jet. How on earth could you possibly be expected to live with just one jet in your backyard? Come on. And people flock to it. People who get up and talk about how they abuse the money with their billion-dollar rings and their fancy jewelry and their thousands and thousands of dollar suits and their mansions and their cars and their planes and their trips, and people send them more money? I mean, what kind of craziness is that? It says they need to humble themselves. And you know, that sounds wrong because in some ways it is. It's not, often when people hear that, humble ourselves, they say, well, you know, I just have to act humble even though I don't deserve it. No, it's not, I have to pretend that I'm less than I am. Being humble is admitting how bad a state I'm in. It's admitting I can't do it on my own. It's the antithesis of saying, well, there's many ways to God, and I think that I've got a great one. No, I have no way to God. And if God doesn't come to me, we'll never meet up. If He doesn't come down, I can't get up. I'll give you a little experiment for those of us out there who hear people say, oh, you can do anything you set your mind to. Really? I want you to jump up and grab the moon and haul it down. If you cannot reach the moon with your fingers, then how on earth do you think you can reach across eternity's vault and haul God down to your level? Humility is recognizing that we are in need. Isn't very popular today. Hasn't been popular for a while. I remember when, before I went to work at the other job, I was getting together with pastors to pray. When you would pray prayers about how unworthy we were, pastors would get mad. No, we're not. We're doing great. Then why are we here? I remember one meeting we had where a group of pastors stormed out and never came back. I don't want to hear prayers like that. Humble themselves. Second of all, pray. Pray. Now, the prayer here, you notice, is coming together to pray. I want you to notice some examples in the Bible. Nehemiah chapter 9. We'll be back. Put that marker in there in 2 Chronicles. We'll be back. Nehemiah 9. Nehemiah 9. Now, again, Nehemiah 9 takes place after the Feast of Tabernacles. They'd come together. And they've been hearing preaching for 7 straight days. And they've come to the realization of how sinful they are. They have humbled themselves. So now what do? Nehemiah 9, that's all in Nehemiah 8. We could stay here for 3 or 4 weeks in Nehemiah 8 and 9 and just go through this. But you can read Nehemiah 8 where all that happened. In Nehemiah 9, on the 24th day of the same month, the Israelites gathered together, fasting and wearing sackcloth and having dusts on their heads. The response to when God draws near to humble us is that we come together for prayer and fasting. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. Corporate prayer. That's why I preach so often the need for corporate prayer. People say, well, I pray at home. That is wonderful. There is a place for private prayer. But when the Lord pours out all of any kind of disasters upon us, that is the time when we come together to pray. And he prays this long prayer. It's found in Nehemiah 9, verses 5, all the way down to 37. A prayer of confession, a prayer of humility, a prayer of need. One of the things that would be a positive thing in every believer's life is to simply pray through the prayers. This prayer in Nehemiah 9, the prayer in Daniel 9, and see how much of that prayer applies to us and how much of it, I'm not just talking read through it, I'm talking about stop and think about what he's saying in every phrase and think about how that applies to us and how I need to pray that exact same thought to him. What happened when Jesus left the disciples alone? Where's that happen? Where does Jesus leave the disciples alone? Acts chapter 1. He took him outside the city, and while he was there, the angels came down, and he went to heaven, and they were left behind. I'm sure when they saw the angels coming for them, they were thinking, woohoo, we're out of here. And they weren't. And they go back to the city, to the same city that killed him. Just a few weeks earlier. The same city that cried for his blood, crucify him, crucify him. They go back to that city. And what does the Bible say they do? Acts chapter 1, verse 14. They continued together in prayer. They understood the biblical commands to come together and pray. Acts chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. Acts chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. The first real organized persecution of the believers without Jesus being there as the lightning rod happens in Acts chapter 4. Peter and John are out preaching on the street. They're rounded up, they're arrested, they're taken before the Sanhedrin, they're threatened. After a bunch of threatening and kicking them around for a little bit, they turn them loose. And what do immediately after they've been kicked loose? They go home to their prayer closet? No. They went back to their people, and they lifted up their voices together, and they prayed. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. And in that prayer, I want you to notice that it is not a prayer of seeking God's hand. So much of prayer today is seeking God's hand. What do I mean by that? Asking for stuff. Even if it's spiritual stuff. Oh God, heal this person. Oh God, save this marriage. Oh God, change this situation. Oh God, oh God, oh God. You'd think He was a genie in a lamp and that we were just rubbing on that thing. The prayer is seeking Him and His kingdom. That's why Jesus said, when you pray, pray what? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What's the next phrase? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. It's about you, God. It's about your glory, about your honor, about you getting what you deserve. And then number 3, we're to gather together and pray. We're to humble ourselves. We're to gather together and pray. And number 3, notice what it says, and turn from their wicked ways. It does no good to pray and remain steeped in sin. We have a church in America today that believes that sin and prayer go together. That if I can just add some mumbo jumbo to the end of that prayer and throw some words there at the end, it doesn't matter how I'm living, what I'm doing, what I want to do, what I long to do. We can ask for whatever we want, and God's going to have to jump to it because that's what He better do. But God says there's a third component. It's not enough to humble ourselves. It's not enough to pray. We need to turn from our wicked ways. Let me give you 2 examples of that. The first is found in 2 Kings. Keep that thing in 2 Chronicles. We will be back. 2 Kings chapter 18. 2 Kings chapter 18. Second Kings chapter 18 is one of the greatest kings. In fact, he's described as a king without equal of the kings of Judah. Right in this text in 2 Kings chapter 18, it says, there was never a king of Judah like him, not before him, not after him. And here's what it says. 2 Kings 18, the first verse, 2 Kings 18:1. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Jebah, daughter of Zechariah, and he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places. Notice when it talks about him doing what his father David did, when it talks about him doing right in the eyes of the Lord, the first thing he did was he cleaned up sin. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stone, cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. He cleaned up the sin of the people. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. Turn over a little bit, 2 Chronicles. Let's go back to 2 Chronicles. Keep that marker in 7 because we're going to race right by it to 34, and then we'll be back. to 7. Second Chronicles 34, the very first verse. We have another of the great kings. If Hezekiah was the greatest of all the kings of Judah, this man, Josiah, was probably the second greatest of all of them. And here's what it says. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. You young people here, if you think that you're too young to do this, think again. 8 years old. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David and turned us and not turning aside to the right or to the left. In his 8th year of his reign, how old is he now? He's 16. He is a 10th grader. While he was still young, he began to seek the Lord, the God of his father. And in his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places. Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols and the images. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on their own altars. So he purged Judah and Jerusalem in the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and in the ruins around them. He tore down the altars and the Asherah poles, and he crushed the idols to powder, and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. Then he went back to Jerusalem. We want God to hear. The next step that has to happen is we have to get serious about cutting down the idols and the Asherah poles and the altars to Baal in the lives of God's people. Starting, the Bible, I forget who it was, a great man once said, the key to revival is to draw a circle, step into the middle of the circle, and start by praying for revival for everyone in the circle. It's easy to point the finger out there. It needs to start with us. What are the Asherah poles in our lives? What are the things that maybe God once blessed? Remember, Hezekiah destroyed the bronze serpent Moses had built. God commanded Moses to make that bronze snake. The people were commanded to look to it, but they made it an idol. You can have idols in your life that God made for you, that God commanded you to do. But you can begin to treat them as idols because you worship them and not Him. What are the idols that we need to cast out of our own lives? Now, third of all, we have the participants, my people. We have the actions. Humble ourselves, pray, turn from our wicked ways. Then we have the promise. And God gives 3 promises to go with the 3 behaviors that He requires. There are 3 behaviors. Humble ourselves, pray, turn from our wicked ways. There are 3 promises God gives in response. Number 1, look at verse 14 still. Then I will hear. People say, well, God's always listening. No, He's not. There are times when God shuts His ears. There are times when God doesn't hear a word we say because we're not saying the right things. Any good parent will tell you that. There are times when you stop listening to your children. When you've told them what they need to do and say, and they're doing anything but that, you just ignore them. Let them go off on their tantrum. Let them play their little game. And when the situation gets so bad that even they can't live with it, what do? They come back and go, okay. Last night I ate out at the buffet, and there were 3 children, 2-year-olds. God loves 2-year-olds. Do you know why God made 2-year-olds so cute? Because if He didn't make them that cute, they'd never live to 3. And those 3 were carrying on a conversation across the hall to see who could outscream one another. All 3 of them decided that they didn't like something that was going on there, and boy, they were going to let their protest be known. And you know what everybody did, rightfully? They ignored it. Too often we run to kids, oh, let's give them what they want. No. Oh, the parents dealt with them. And the one kid kept trying to climb out of their chair, the little high chairs there. Dad came over and tied him tightly into the chair and said, there. And he pulled and tugged and hugged and finally said, okay, problem's over. I'll start eating now. I don't know what the other 2 did because they were at the far end of the room. And that's what God does. He says, when you've done these 3 things, I'll hear. I'll open my ears. God wants to do that. Jeremiah 8:6. You don't need to turn there, but please write this verse down. Jeremiah 8:6. God says, I listened intently to hear what you would say, but no one said what was right. God is listening, but He's only listening for the right stuff. You can blather on about what you want and what you need and what you think you deserve and on and on and on. And God's saying, I'm waiting for you to talk about my kingdom, my honor, my glory. And I'm listening. And when you come around to my agenda, then I'll start talking. Do you remember what 1 John 5:14 says? 1 John 5:14, another verse you need to write down. 1 John 5:14. If we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. Number 2, second promise. Not only does He say, I hear, He says, number 2, I will forgive their sins. We may not believe that we need forgiveness today, but we do not comprehend how much we do. Do you know how we have ruined an entire generation of children? I'm talking to us adults here now. Do you know how much we have ruined an entire generation of children? We've allowed them to be steeped in wickedness. We have sent them to institutions that have deliberately, methodically, systematically indoctrinated them in wickedness. And many of us took out loans to pay huge amounts to send them off to more schools to do more of the same. Do you understand how much we need to be forgiven? We have children that can play video games like champions. They can march in the street calling for the destruction of Israel and call Israel genocidal Nazis. What an abomination. And it's happening on campuses all across America. While extolling the virtues of the Palestinians who are murdering rapists. And we paid money to make them that way. Do you know how much we need to be forgiven? Yeah. There's people out there talking, we need to ban AR-15s. Do you know how many mass shootings in America has been caused by an AR-15, you can count it very easily. Do you know what the number is? 1. And that's only because they've made such a big deal about it now that somebody actually tried and did it. How many babies are murdered every single year? 64 million in the last, what is it? No, more than that. 50 years, coming up on 60, 1972. 52 years. 64 million, 10 million a year on average. They say the most dangerous place, these people that are lying to the society say, oh, it's dangerous to send your kids to school. No, it's dangerous to have your children in a womb. It's the most dangerous place on earth for a human child. He will forgive. And then number 3, and here we come to the crux of the matter, and why it is that I can say with authority that it is only God's people that matter for the history, for the future of our nation. Because he says not only will he hear, not only will he forgive, but number 3, he says he will heal their land. Do you want to clean up the politics? God says he'll heal our land. You want to get rid of the lies in the media? God says he'll heal our land. You want to get rid of school shootings and mass killings and riots in the street that burn down entire neighborhoods so that cities are never the same? Do you know what one of the biggest cries in America is today? That there are medication deserts. That there are whole swaths in major cities where there's not a single place that you can go to get a medication. And anybody who doesn't have a car and can't drive 20 or 30 miles can't get a medication. Do you know why that's true? Because the prosecutors in those cities allow criminals to go in and steal anything they want and don't allow them to be prosecuted. So the companies say, we're not just going to set up stores to be stolen from. We're out of here. And then the same people that caused the problem turn around and go, oh, it's so horrible. You want that healed? It won't happen by accident. God says he needs to heal that kind of stupidity. There's no earthly cure for that kind of craziness. That has to come down from heaven. Here's my question. Are you ready to pay the price for personal revival? For church revival? For community revival? To even have a hope of maybe a national revival? To come back to where we ought to be? Personally, collectively, to see it out there. However far it extends, if you are, the cost is going to be coming together to pray. And yeah, it's fine to come together. I can remember a pastor telling me, oh, we had such a great prayer meeting. There was a child in the church that was diagnosed with cancer, and the whole church showed up to pray. That's wonderful. But why is it only that we'll pray about our needs with that kind of desperation? Because I've been in that same church when they put a call out to come together to pray for the fallen state of the church, and 3 people showed up and slept through it. Are you willing to pay the price to come together and pray? Because God said if. He said it's not going to be automatic. It won't happen no matter how bad things get. 30 years ago, I thought, man, when Bill Clinton was president, I thought, man, can it get any worse than this? I saw a meme the other day, and it was, I think it was Tommy Lee Jones sitting there, and he goes, I've got to stop saying, how dumb can you be, because you're taking it as a challenge and trying to outdo yourself. I thought, man, can it get any worse? After Ronald Reagan's years, and I had the privilege of living through that time of at least national uplifting. And now we look back and go, wow, wouldn't it be great to go back there? If we've come this far down in the last 30 years, how much further will we go in the next 30? 30 years, I'll be my mom's age. I don't think I'll get there, but I might. Man, if I do, how low will we have gotten? Does that motivate you, or do we go, okay, well, I guess it's gotten this bad and I'm still here, so if it gets worse, I'll just roll with it? Do you want your grandchildren who are growing up, or your children who are growing up in these days, who think this is normal, to look back with their children or grandchildren and go, wow, how low it's gone? Or do you want your children or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren to be the ones who say, I remember the bad old days before God came back and changed our nation? It's not going to happen by happenstance.